My gravely ill husband slowly woke up. I immediately covered his mouth and nose. What a gloomy morning! The next day, the funeral was held. Do you wish to fake your death and then take the family fortune and live a carefree, secluded life? Then I'll make your fake death a real one. Mother-in-law dug up her son to give him the antidote, only to discover he had long been truly dead. Half a month ago, my husband fell ill. A sudden illness without warning, and worsening day by day. Even the doctors couldn't identify the cause. They only said his days were numbered, leaving me to decide what to do. Mother-in-law wept endlessly in despair, declaring she would go to Yunshin Temple to pray for him. As my husband's moments of consciousness grew shorter, I worried so much that I couldn't sleep a wink at night. One night, I stepped out for fresh air, only to stumble upon my husband, intimately leaning against another woman, beside the rock garden, whispering secrets to one another. Lu Lang, you must make all the arrangements properly. I'll be waiting at home with our dear Howard and Char. Lu Chen held her shoulders tightly, embracing her steadily. He reassured Hu and Yang, don't worry, everything is ready. Half a month from now, I'll leave. You just need to remember this. Dig me out within 3 days. Give me the antidote, and I'll wake up immediately. He poured his heart out to her. Once I'm gone. She obediently observed mourning for 3 years. 3 years will give you plenty of time to ensure she meets an accident or succumbs to some misfortune, and it won't tarnish my reputation. Hu and Yang, cautious as always, added, to be safe, we shouldn't meet again for now. Sorry to trouble you with caring for Heng and Cha alone. He caressed Hu and Yang's face gently, reluctant to part with her. Hu and Yang clasped his hand tightly, emotionally saying, husband, you've endured so much these years. Feigned affection and dealt with her despite the disgust. Lu Chen rested his chin against her forehead, his hand gripping hers in silent reassurance, giving her strength. His words were incredibly gentle, yet chillingly ruthless. If it weren't for her father holding an official position at court, there's no way I'd have married her into this household. I wouldn't have needed to stoop to such tricks. It's just bad luck on her part. But fortunately, over the years, I've managed to multiply her dowry several times over. It's enough for us to live anonymously for 1 or 2 lifetimes without worrying. In the moonlight, their shadows intertwined, creating a scene of romantic warmth. But to me, it felt as though I had plunged into an icy abyss. On the coldest winter night, my limbs trembled weakly, my whole body freezing to the bone. So cold I couldn't breathe. The husband who had always shown me love and respect had fathered a child with another woman. He planned his own death, just to escape and enjoy a happy life with them. For the sake of his cursed reputation, he was even willing to take my life. All these years, I had been living with a heartless monster, day in and day out. I stumbled back to my room, unable to sleep, spending the entire night with my eyes wide open until dawn. The stillness of the night gave me enough time to figure out the path I should take from now on. I didn't bother with dressing up, carrying my dark, tired eyes to visit my husband. When I arrived, he had just woken up. Seeing me, he reached out, with a face full of tenderness. I suppressed the anger and disgust in my heart. As always, I gently extended my hand, leaning against his chest. In the past, it was because I couldn't bear to let him leave me, deeply attached to him. But now, I opened my sharp eyes in the shadows where he couldn't see. If you wish to fake your death, I'll help you make it real. Madam, it seems you haven't rested well again, have you? He gently rubbed the dark circles under my eyes, his voice sincere and full of worrying, overflowing with reluctant tenderness. It was this very affectionate appearance that deceived me for years. How truly detestable. I pretended to wipe the corner of my eyes, forcing a smile with reddened rims. Husband, don't worry, I said softly. I've slept very well. Who doesn't have a bit of talent for acting? As usual, I massaged his body for a while, bowed down to serve him, and watched as he fell back asleep. My expression turned icy. I went to the study to retrieve his personal seal, then headed to Yangshan Bank to transfer all his silver savings into my name. My husband's illness grew more severe. Sometimes he would remain unconscious for an entire day. I stayed by his bedside day and night, receiving endless praise from everyone for my deep love and devotion to my husband. But I knew I was merely afraid that someday he would discover I had already transferred the assets he sold off. I didn't want him to stop pretending to be sick. I had to stay close and guard against any changes. ZC, the young servant attending to him, frequently urged me to take better care of myself, saying that he could handle caring for my husband. But as his advice grew frequent, his tone began to sour. I coldly ordered him to leave. My husband is mine to care for. I'll tend to him myself. Or are you the master here? Liu Ming bowed his head and said, I wouldn't dare before retreating. But a flicker of resentment flashed in his eyes. A few nights later, Lu Chen truly woke up, but his gaze toward me was much colder. I understood at once he already knew everything. But so what? Though he had feigned his illness, to make it believable, he had actually taken the medicine. Now his body, under the effects of the drugs, *** had become exceedingly weak. So weak that he couldn't fight back against me at all. I grabbed his mouth and nose with my hands, ignoring his struggles, refusing to let go. Within moments, he stopped moving. Tears streamed silently down my cheeks, but my expression remained icy. Sorry, I murmured, you made the first move. Don't blame me for making the final one. His eyes were wide open, filled with terror and helplessness. I gently closed his eyelids, adjusted his expression to look more peaceful, and sat numbly by the bed. I remembered the flower viewing banquet years ago. The second young lady of the Rongchang Count's estate, along with other noble daughters, mocked my poor needlework skills. I had hidden away in a quiet spot, crying. Lu Chen came to console me. He made me a grass rabbit, then fashioned a clay frog, pulling funny faces to cheer me up. I had finally smiled. After that, he would frequently bring amusing little trinkets to delight me. We often met at the back hill. He once told me he had only come to the flower banquet to deliver books for a classmate. He happened to find me crying, and so he comforted me. He had delicate, handsome features, a tall and slender figure, and was quite pleasant to look at. After giving me nearly 100 little gifts, I had an intimate relationship with him. My parents were furious, locking the door behind them, slapping me hard across the face. Yet they had no choice but to agree to our marriage. Father was an Imperial Academy scholar. If word got out that I had engaged in a scandal with someone, his career would be severely damaged. Fearing that I might already be pregnant, they rushed to arrange the marriage. Although I had committed such a grave mistake, I was their only daughter. Naturally, they spared no expense, preparing a generous dowry for me in the shortest time possible. Lu Chen also worked hard, striving to improve after we got married. Though he had little talent in academics, he possessed an extraordinary gift for business. Mother-in-law was always proud of him, but she deeply disapproved of me, holding disdain for the fact that I had been intimate with him before marriage. She often scolded me and berated Lu Chen for settling for me. She never showed me a kind face, constantly imposing rules upon me. Just 3 months after our wedding, she took it upon herself to bring in a concubine for Lu Chen, claiming it was because I was childless and unfilial. But Lu Chen never once set foot in the concubine's quarters. From that moment on, she stopped sending women to his room. But his hatred toward me only grew deeper. I used to foolishly believe that Lu Chen was remaining faithful to me out of love, until I overheard his midnight conversation with Huan Yang the other night. I finally understood that his so-called fidelity was reserved for that woman named Huan Yang. For years, I hadn't conceived a child. Even Dr. Chiao confirmed there was nothing wrong with me. There could only be one explanation. Lu Chen didn't want me to bear his children. I had caught him taking medicine a few times before, but he always gave me different excuses. Once he said he was coughing up phlegm. Another time, He claimed his back and knees were sore, and sometimes he said he had headaches when exposed to wind. Each time, he had the doctor prescribe him medicine. Looking back now, his true goal in approaching me was to exploit my dowry, using it to provide for his family and their comfortable life. It was all for their peace and luxury. Not long ago, I had just stumbled upon his affair with Huan Yang. The fury and bitterness overwhelmed me, but the dead are like extinguished lamps. From now on, I must live for myself. I sat by his bedside, sleepless for the entire night. At dawn, I announced his death, arranged for the funeral to take place, and sent someone to fetch mother-in-law from Yunshan Temple. The moment she returned, she collapsed in tears beside the coffin. She had once agreed with Lu Chen that he would need 19 days to complete the plan. Now it was only the 14th day, yet he was already gone. Her confusion was evident, suspecting something was amiss. She cried while pushing the coffin lid open. I knew she wanted to check for any trickery. I didn't stop her. When she opened it, she wailed even louder, her voice turning hoarse. "My son, oh my son," she sobbed. "How could you leave so soon? I was still praying for you. How could you bear to abandon your mother and your wife?" Crying and crying, she eventually fainted. I ordered someone to carry her back to rest. After all, the guests were still present. Mother-in-law didn't make things difficult for me, but this only made my heart grow colder. With her nature, even the tiniest issue would be my fault. Now, when her only son, the pride of her family, suddenly died, she didn't even question me. There was only one explanation. She already knew about Lu Chen's plan. Or worse, the three of them, Lu Chen, Huan Yang, and mother-in-law, had conspired together, keeping me in the dark. They had waited for my husband to fake his death, escape, and take all the family fortune for their 5-member household, leaving behind empty shell businesses for me to shoulder the losses. My chest tightened with rage. Yet I also felt exhilarated. If that were the case, I no longer needed to feel any guilt. Once all the guests had arrived, a sudden commotion erupted from the outer courtyard. My personal maid, Shuanger, came rushing in to report. She said that someone, taking advantage of my husband's death, had tried to steal valuables and escape but was caught. The culprit was being dragged in by a few servants. It turned out to be Liu Ming, who had already been beaten severely. Panting heavily like a dying dog, he glared at me with pure hatred. Someone held a bundle, retrieved from Liu Ming's belongings. They opened it in front of everyone. Inside were valuable calligraphy tools from Lu Chen's study, silver ingots, scattered coins, and banknotes, everything you could imagine. There were also numerous gold and silver hair ornaments, clearly belonging to women. The sight left all the guests in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the stolen treasures. Mother-in-law, furious, began cursing loudly. While hastily gathering up the stolen valuables, I continued my mourning, my eyes still red from crying, my demeanor frail and soft. Yet my face was filled with righteous anger as I pointed at Liu Ming, accusing him. "Liu Ming, how dare you? Have you no conscience, or has it been eaten by dogs? My husband valued you the most. He's barely closed his eyes, his body not even cold yet, and you've already tried to steal everything from our household and escape." I feigned indignation, letting myself faint in anger, prompting Shuanger and others to help me into my room. The crowd clamored for the authorities to be called, declaring that such a wicked servant must not be let off. Liu Ming was terrified by this, and in desperation, he shouted that he was innocent. He even accused me of murdering my own husband. But with all the evidence of his theft in plain sight, how could anyone believe his absurd claims? The onlookers assumed he was merely making a last-ditch effort, biting back with baseless accusations. Mother-in-law, worried that an official investigation might expose Lu Chen's plan and ruin everything, was overcome with rage. She gave the order on the spot to have Liu Ming beaten to death immediately. I let out a small sigh of relief. After the funeral procession departed, I quietly opened my eyes. Liu Ming, that wretched dog, was indeed one of the accomplices. He was a servant I had brought with me when I married. All these years, it was my money that paid his wages, as well as his parents' living expenses. I even covered the cost of their livelihood. When his father fell gravely ill years ago, I was the one who sought out a doctor to save him. And yet, despite all this, he conspired with Liu Chen to see me dead. It was an unforgivable betrayal. Liu Ming had to die. He knew everything about Liu Chen's plans. Naturally, he also knew that I had secretly given events a push. Keeping him alive would always be a hidden threat. He was someone easily swayed by his own desires. Now that his master was dead, how could he not start planning for his own future? Thus, I deliberately misled him into taking those valuables. In the confirmed absence of my husband, how could he resist such a temptation? The bundle of items he tried to steal today contained a few genuine silver ingots and coins, but the banknotes and treasures were all counterfeit. But what did that matter? Mother-in-law had already gathered the entire household's fortune and publicly claimed it all as hers. She could no longer pin any blame on me. If she insisted on doing so, she would only succeed in ruining her own reputation as greedy and overbearing. She had no path left to attack me. The next 3 days of rest were crucial for my plan. During these 3 days, I feigned being deeply shaken by the events, pretending to be utterly broken. Mother-in-law, seeing this, offered to let me return to my parents' home to recover. Her initiative deeply moved me. Before leaving, I deliberately lingered before her, asking whether she would accompany me to the capital. Her eyes darted nervously around, noticing that I was only bringing a maid with me. She then went to Liu Chen's study for a moment, confirming that his personal seal was still there. She said nothing further, shaking her head and declaring that she would stay behind, which suited me perfectly. I wasted no time, ordering the coachman to drive me swiftly to the capital. When my parents learned that I had lost my husband so suddenly, and that I had returned to the capital barely holding myself together, they were heartbroken. Father was especially distraught, even submitting a request for leave from court to properly console and care for me. The emperor approved my father's leave to care for me in the capital. The day after I arrived, mother-in-law came storming in from Longzhou. Her face was twisted with rage and hatred, banging furiously on the gates, accusing me of killing my husband, demanding my life as compensation. My father, protective yet shrewd, addressed her as dear-in-law and suggested bringing her inside to talk things over. But mother-in-law refused to step inside. When I went out, she had already gathered a crowd at the gates, shouting that I had murdered Liu Chen. Seeing me appear behind my father, her fury reached a breaking point. Pointing a trembling finger at me, she screamed, "You vile woman! You're the one who killed my son. I'll have your life in exchange for his." She lunged at me, intending to hit me. I shrank back, hiding in my mother's embrace, while discreetly tugging at my father's sleeve with one hand, looking pitiful and tearful. People naturally sympathize with the weak. Seeing my frail demeanor, the onlookers quickly associated her wrath with the image of a vicious mother-in-law and a wronged daughter-in-law. Both my parents were enraged by the spectacle. My father coldly rebuked her. "In-law, you're out of your mind. Take her away at once, before you frighten my daughter further." Mother-in-law refused to leave, continuing her tirade against me in a frenzied manner. If not for others holding her back, she would have certainly attacked me. "You'll face retribution," she cursed. "You murdered my son, then fled to the capital to hide. You wretched woman. I should never have let you into my family. You ruined my boy." With reddened eyes, I timidly poked my head out, looking at her with hesitation and fear. Biting my lips softly, I said in a trembling voice, "Mother, you know full well my husband died of illness. You even went to pray for him. Didn't you tell me to return to my parents' home? Many people heard you say it. Just yesterday, I even asked if you would come back with me. You said you wouldn't. So why this sudden change today? I understand you're grieving the loss of your son. It's hard to accept, I know. But I've also lost my husband." As I spoke, my voice choked with emotion. Everything I said was verifiable, so I wasn't afraid of the scrutiny. The onlookers began urging her to stop troubling me. She's lost her son, they murmured. But this woman has also lost her husband. Her pain is no less than hers. Mother-in-law, unable to explain herself, couldn't exactly reveal the truth that her son had faked his illness and staged his death to escape. Seeing that she couldn't overpower me, she made a desperate move, lunging toward my father in an attempt to kill him. Father quickly shielded me behind him, telling me not to come out, letting her vent her madness unchecked. Lu Chen had always been meticulous. Even in this matter, he had thought everything through. His plan was likely to prevent mother-in-law from giving anything away too early. That's why he fell ill, arranged for her to pray at the temple for half a month, and insisted on a full 19 days before she could act. He had carefully calculated the exact timing of his death. At that time, mother-in-law, along with Huan Yang and the others, could dig him up, and they'd leave together with the family fortune to live out their days in hiding. Thanks to this overly elaborate plan, it had now become irrefutable evidence. Even if she went to the authorities, a simple investigation would reveal the truth. Lu Chen had indeed died from a serious illness. Mother-in-law hadn't prayed long enough for him, spending just 2 weeks at the temple instead of the required 19 days. I cared for him day and night, setting an example of what a virtuous wife should be. How could I possibly be the one behind his death? Mother-in-law wouldn't dare take this matter to the authorities. If she did, their scheme of faking his death and hiding away would surely be exposed. Mother-in-law caused a ruckus for 3 days straight. By the 3rd day, father had had enough. He charged her with disturbing the peace and reported her to the authorities. The moment she saw the officers arriving to arrest her, she immediately fled. But she didn't give up entirely. Soon, she returned to my doorstep. This time, she came demanding the return of the family fortune. Her eyes burned with fury, as if she wanted to devour me. She cursed me viciously, calling me a lowly woman from Jishan, a thief, demanding I return her family's wealth. It wasn't enough for you to kill my son, she spat. You even stole the family fortune. So malicious. Why haven't you died yet? A crowd gathered again at the gate. I smirked to myself in silence. Let her curse. The more she cursed, the more unreasonable she appeared. The harsher her words, the better it was for me. Since her last visit, I had secretly sent people to selectively spread the story of what had transpired between me and Lu Chen. It was carefully edited, and the tale was quietly disseminated across the city. Now, everyone in the capital knew that. The only daughter of Scholar Chen married into a modest family with Lu Chen, only to suffer endless mistreatment from her in-laws. When her husband fell ill, she tirelessly cared for him, while her mother-in-law hid away at Yunshan Temple. After her husband's death, she was pursued to the capital and harassed by her mother-in-law. Merchants who traveled between the regions were familiar with the details. They spoke of how Lu Chen had been gravely ill, how I had cared for him tirelessly without rest, and how I was so devastated by his death that I returned to the capital alone. Before long, the rumors spread widely, saying that I had only taken a maid with me when I left, bringing nothing else along, not even my dowry, which remained with the Lu family. So how could I possibly have taken the family fortune? There were even witnesses who claimed to have seen mother-in-law personally pack up and take all the valuables. Yet here she was, still relentlessly accusing me, making it clear that she was hoping to extort more money from the scholar's estate. With her son now dead, and no grandson to carry on the family name, she must have been eyeing my well-off natal family. To outsiders, it was obvious. My father would surely find me another reliable marriage match, but that would leave her a former mother-in-law utterly alone. She was clearly scheming to grab as much as she could while she still had the chance. One scandal followed another. The commotion at the gate turned into quite the spectacle. Some people even brought small stools to sit and watch the drama unfold. But the crowd's sympathies were entirely on my side. This drove mother-in-law mad with frustration, making her claw at herself in rage. She kept trying to explain to the crowd that I had transferred all the family assets, and that the bundle of valuables was fake. But the more she explained, the more the crowd despised her. They believed her capable of anything to achieve her goals. My father, furious, finally ordered her thrown out of the estate. I tugged lightly at his sleeve, laughing softly. Such a golden opportunity, I couldn't let father ruin it. For the sake of my reputation, father reluctantly restrained himself. I stayed behind my parents, appearing on the verge of tears, but inside I was laughing heartily. When it came to the matter of the family fortune, I couldn't help but thank Lu Chen for his meticulous planning back then. Ever since we got married, he used my dowry as the foundation, and with his sharp business acumen, he managed to multiply it several times over in just a few short years. Lu Chen was always cautious. The remaining assets had all been gradually converted into banknotes and safely stored in a money house. They were meant to support his family after his death. Mother-in-law and Huan Yang, however, were terrible at managing affairs, giving me the perfect opportunity to act. And since that stash of silver couldn't be openly declared, exposing it would reveal their malicious intent, leaving them utterly defenseless. The public would not forgive them. Who could have expected someone to be so shameless? It was obvious her son had died, and fearing no one would care for her, she clung to me like a parasite. Poor Miss G, such a kind soul. To have encountered such an unreasonable and venomous mother-in-law, what could her lowly-born son have truly accomplished? If their household was prosperous, it was entirely thanks to Miss G's dowry. Miss G had clearly returned empty-handed, leaving her dowry behind in Rongzhou. Even that wasn't enough for them. What greed there like a snake trying to swallow an elephant? And to falsely accuse Miss G of harming her son? It's clear that she was the one blinded by ambition, deliberately killing her own son. To frame Miss G, mother-in-law's face flushed red with anger, but one voice couldn't overpower the crowd. Desperate, she shouted back, "You bunch of poor fools. Do you think her dowry was worth that much? Everything else was earned by my son. I love my son dearly, I'd never harm him. How dare you accuse me of such a thing? You're all just a bunch of ignorant old hags." Her thoughts were as venomous as her words, and she was told to go die somewhere else. Seeing mother-in-law rendered speechless, flailing about in a desperate frenzy, brought me great satisfaction. Her words instantly offended the crowd, who now looked at her like she was mad. They pointed and whispered among themselves, mocking her as if throwing trash into a bin. Mother-in-law trembled with anger, her chest heaving violently, clearly on the verge of an outburst. "You shameless viper, Jishan," she shrieked. "Why don't you explain everything to them? That money was all earned by my son." I jumped in fright, pulling back timidly. Mother-in-law, infuriated and losing control, suddenly broke free from those holding her, charging at me with intent to strike. But someone deliberately stuck out a leg, and she fell flat on her face like a clumsy dog eating mud. She completely lost her composure, thrashing and shouting wildly. "You all are blind and deaf," she screamed. "I'm not the venomous one. You vile and malicious Jishan, give me back what's rightfully mine. Return all the money my son earned. With such a guilty conscience, aren't you afraid of divine retribution?" I looked uneasy, my eyes reddening as I murmured, "Mother-in-law, I truly didn't. My dowry is still in Rongzhou. You were the one who told me to return to my parents' home to recover. I only brought Schwanger with me." As everyone saw, Schwanger nodded firmly beside me, raising her voice to say, "Old madam, it was clearly you who sent madam back to her family. All the family assets are still in your hands. Even with master's death, madam fell ill from the grief. And now you're here slandering her like this. And now you've come to her family's home to demand her dowry. Why can't you just leave her alone? Clearly, you deliberately sent your daughter-in-law back to her parents' house, only to accuse her of killing your son later, all to extort money from her family. When that scheme failed and was exposed, you came up with another lie, saying the silver your son supposedly earned was actually from the dowry gifted by Sir G and Madam G to Miss G. You chased her away, stole her dowry, and still wouldn't let her go. Now following her to her parents' home. Have you no shame? Father commanded coldly, "Take her away. Stop causing trouble at our gate." Mother-in-law's face turned beet red, her lips trembling violently. Her breathing became labored. Somehow, she managed to break free. She rushed forward, reaching out to grab my hair. But a strong hand caught her wrist midair. A pair of cold, icy eyes stared her down. "How dare you?" a commanding voice rang out. I followed the voice and turned my head. It was my distant cousin, Mo Kang. He was a relative from a lineage so far removed that his grandfather's ancestor had a faint connection with my maternal great-grandfather. After losing his parents in his youth, and being exceptionally talented in his studies, my father couldn't bear to see his potential wasted. He brought him to our household, where he lived for several years. After passing the imperial exam, he was sent to the Imperial Academy. My father had been like a mentor to him, but he never showed much enthusiasm for the political arena. He later withdrew to focus on business, and now, as a wealthy merchant of immense renown, he stood tall and strikingly handsome, yet remained unmarried. At this moment, his face was stern, and the men he brought surrounded us completely, declaring they would send mother-in-law directly to the magistrate's office. Mother-in-law's legs went weak with fear. Terrified that her schemes would be exposed, she no longer cared about the family fortune. Just like before, she fled without a trace. The crowd, having seen her wild accusations moments ago, noticed how quickly she ran at the mention of authorities and became even more convinced of her guilt. Under my cousin's authoritative gaze, the crowd dispersed, but not without gossiping about mother-in-law's character. After hearing my story, my cousin's face grew so dark it seemed ready to storm. "If you face anything like this again," he said, "come to me directly." He then asked, "What are your plans now?" My plan, of course, was to sever all ties with Lu Chen, but this wasn't something I could share with him. I had no intention of revealing my next steps to him. Cousin cautiously asked, "Now that he's gone, and your mother-in-law is like this, are you really planning to go back?" I replied with certainty. My return this time is to put everything back in its proper place. There are some things that need to be handled before I can move on. Once everything is resolved, I'll leave openly and with dignity. After that, I'll live a peaceful, carefree life. Hearing that I intended to return, my cousin's expression dimmed with a hint of sorrow. Noticing this, I thought it best to reassure him, so he wouldn't worry unnecessarily. "Thank you, cousin, for stepping in today and helping me out. But after all, I'm still technically their daughter-in-law. There are some matters I must face and resolve myself. When the time comes, everything will be taken care of. I'll return to the Lu residence myself." He left, looking troubled and deep in thought. I shared my intention of returning to my in-laws' house with my parents. Mother clutched my hand tightly, unable to hide her concern. "Your mother-in-law doesn't look like a kind soul," she said. "Even after you've returned home, she dared to chase you down, causing such a commotion. How could your father-in-law not step in to stop her?" Father agreed with her. "Your mother is right," he said. "Letting you go back now, who knows what she'd do to you." My parents were understandably uneasy. I held both their hands. Speaking softly, "My husband just passed away. It's understandable that his family might not think straight for a while. Besides, I'm still their daughter-in-law. Eventually, I have to return to settle everything." Mother's eyes welled up with tears. "My child, you're still so young," she sobbed. "Do you mean to spend your life as a widow for him?" "Of course not," I replied with a chuckle. "He doesn't deserve that honor. My first step is to ruin his mother, to see my mother-in-law's reputation destroyed. The second step is to cut all ties with their family and pull myself out of this pit. I'll let them fight among themselves." Father continued to persuade me to reconsider, but I reassured them. My husband just died. Who knows what the future holds? I'll take good care of myself. And if you're really worried about me, just assign me a few strong guards trained in martial arts. My parents reluctantly agreed. With 10 or so robust guards that father personally selected, I returned to the Lu family estate. Mother-in-law had planned to ambush me at the door, intending to intimidate me with a show of dominance. Through the closed gate, she shouted threats. "If you don't hand over the silver you've stolen, then don't even think about stepping through this door." I stood at the gate, dressed plainly, with reddened eyes that seemed on the verge of tears. If mother-in-law dislikes her daughter-in-law so much, I said softly, then I shall return to my family in the capital. With that, I turned and boarded the carriage without hesitation, hitting the weak spot with precision. It required some effort, but I was willing to go the extra mile. Seeing that I was truly about to leave, mother-in-law clenched her teeth in frustration and hurriedly ordered the gates to be opened. Still holding on to her anger, she approached, raising her hand as if to slap me, but noticing the murmuring crowd outside, she stopped abruptly, her face darkening. Reluctantly, she allowed me into the estate. Once you're inside, let's see how I deal with you, she muttered darkly, scolding me under her breath. I feigned fear, but inwardly I was brimming with satisfaction. Once inside, we'll see who deals with whom. She refused to let the dozen guards I brought from the capital enter the estate. We don't need so many people here, she declared. Dismiss them immediately. I looked at her intently for a moment, then waved the guards inside, ordering the gates to be closed. Mother-in-law, seeing this, grew visibly uneasy, her expression shifting between panic and forced composure. Ji-shan, she barked sharply. You've lost your mind. This is the Liu family, not the Ji estate. I am the head of this household. Get them out of here right now. They're not welcome here. I glanced toward the shadow of a group peeking from behind the moon gate, along with two small hands clutching the frame. I smiled faintly. Very well, mother-in-law, I replied sweetly. If you give me a letter of separation today, I'll leave this house with my guards immediately. Hearing my words, her chest heaved violently, her face contorted with rage. You vile woman, she spat, glaring daggers at me. Seething with indignation, my husband hasn't even been gone for a few days. And you're already thinking of seducing other men? Demanding a letter of separation? Keep dreaming, I absolutely won't agree. My son is dead, and you must remain a widow for him. You'll die in our Liu family estate. I calmly sat down, taking a sip of tea. Unhurriedly, I spoke. If that's how mother-in-law feels, then I shall remain my husband's wife. I pointed to 4 of the guards, ordering them to bring out the mother and her 2 children hiding in the house. Mother-in-law's face twisted with fury. You wretched woman, what are you trying to do? She tried to block the guards from going further, but they pushed her aside and dragged out the mother and her 2 children. Hu Yang, even in plain clothing, was strikingly beautiful. Though she appeared disheveled, her beauty was undeniable. But now her face was marked by exhaustion. Lu Chen's death must have hit her hard. When she saw me, hatred blazed in her eyes. She rushed forward, trying to claw at me, but the guards stopped her. The older boy, seeing this, charged at me suddenly. I flinched in surprise, nearly getting hit. Thankfully, one of the guards grabbed him in time. The boy was sturdy and strong, and he seemed to possess remarkable strength. I glanced at the sharp edge of a nearby cactus, feeling a shiver of fear at how close I'd come to falling onto it. Turning back to look at him, I couldn't help but think just like Lu Chen. This child had a streak of unyielding ferocity. He glared at me with pure malice, spitting insults through gritted teeth. You wretched woman, you filthy whore. It's all your fault that father couldn't give us a big house to live in. You caused me to lose my father go die, you vile woman. Even while restrained by the guards, the boy kept trying to kick me. So young, yet already so venomous. I cast a cold, sharp gaze at him, gesturing to the guards to slap him a few times, to teach him a lesson. As he was struck, he continued to hurl curses at me. After a few blows, fear finally flickered in his eyes. He stopped cursing, subdued at last. Hu Yang wasn't spared either. She too was slapped. Mother-in-law glared at me with a murderous look, her eyes practically devouring me alive. The boy appeared to be about 6 or 7 years old. I vaguely recalled that his name was Heng. Calculating the timeline, it was clear that Lu Chen had been with Hu Yang. Even before we were married, the detestable man had approached me deliberately, scheming to exploit my dowry, to build a foundation for his family of 3. And I, foolishly naive, had walked right into his trap. Since they were unafraid to confront me, I decided to use them as an example. Neither Hu and Yang nor mother-in-law expected this side of me. My sudden assertiveness left them stunned. Mother-in-law yelled for the servants to resist, ordering them to kill me. But Lu Chen's household had very few servants to begin with, in his effort to create the illusion of a humble family with little wealth. He had cut down on the number of servants repeatedly. Now, the entire Lu estate had only about 7 or 8 servants in total. Most were either elderly women or young maids, useless in a confrontation. Meanwhile, my side had over 10 guards, all of them strong, burly men. Just the sight of my guards was intimidating enough. Two servants hesitated to approach, but a sharp glance from me sent them scurrying to hide. Mother-in-law's face turned pale with fear. I swept my gaze over her and Hu and Yang, before focusing on the boy from earlier. Hu and Yang glared at me with pure hatred, as if she wanted to tear me apart. If looks could kill, I'd have been stabbed a dozen times by now. The boy, cowed after being struck, now looked at me with fearful eyes, no longer daring to curse. The little girl, who was about 2 or 3 years old, watched silently. Mother-in-law panicked when she realized I might target her grandson next. "Yuva woman," she screamed. "All that submissive behavior earlier was just an act. What do you plan to do to them?" Hu and Yang was equally alarmed, though she forced herself to appear calm. Struggling, she tried to shield her 2 children. "What are you going to do?" I smiled, sizing up the mother and her 2 children. But my words were directed at mother-in-law. "Mother-in-law, aren't you going to introduce them to me? After all, isn't it said that fights lead to familiarity?" Mother-in-law snarled viciously. "Who they are is none of your business. You don't deserve to know, you wretched woman." My eyes narrowed slightly, my tone light but icy. "Is that so? Well, I already know who they are." I turned my gaze to the guards and ordered coldly, "If she utters another insult, treat her the same as them. Keep hitting until she behaves." Mother-in-law opened her mouth to curse me again, but when she saw the guards stepping forward, she immediately swallowed her words, spitting out venomously, "You want a letter of separation?" "No way in hell." I turned to her, shrugging casually. "Since mother-in-law refuses to grant me the letter of separation," I said with a smirk, "we'll just have to continue this conversation another way. Then your precious grandchildren will forever live in the shadows, won't they? Without the proper acknowledgement from the first wife. Hu and Yang can't even be considered a concubine, let alone anything more. Children born to an unrecognized woman will only invite ridicule." Hu and Yang's face turned pale, and she looked at mother-in-law with desperation. Mother-in-law let out a cold laugh, venting her anger as she sneered, "You barren hen. What right do you have to deny my grandchildren's entry into this household? I'll have Hu and Yang brought in as an equal wife. What can you do about it?" Before she could finish, a guard stepped forward and slapped her twice across the face, leaving her stunned. She wanted to lash out, but fear of further punishment kept her in check. Her chest heaved with anger, and she panted heavily. "What can I do?" I asked with a laugh. "It seems you still don't understand the situation. If you want to dig up my husband and marry him to her, go ahead. But as long as I'm here, neither she nor her children will ever be recognized. My husband will remain childless, at least officially." I shrugged casually. "And another thing," I continued, "these 2 children are his, aren't they? As the legal wife, I have the right to raise and educate them. Guards, separate them from their mother. From now on, I'll take over their care." Hu and Yang and mother-in-law were horrified. Hu and Yang struggled desperately, pleading with her eyes for mother-in-law's help. Mother-in-law trembled with rage, her finger shaking as she pointed at me, her fury like a volcano about to erupt. She couldn't even form words. She wanted to curse me, but she also knew better. The dozen guards I brought along weren't here just for show. "So, mother-in-law, will you give me the letter of separation or not?" I idly fiddled with my nails, pretending to be displeased, and frowned slightly. "Maybe I should wait a few days, until your anger has cooled, and then add some new conditions." Mother-in-law clenched her teeth, glaring at me with venomous eyes, but refusing to say a word. I took a step forward, stopping in front of the mother and her children. Anxiety flashed across her face, and she tried to rush forward to stop me, but the guards held her back. I crouched in front of the older boy, handing him a jade hairpin. Hanger looked at me with confusion and surprise, as if wondering if I had lost my mind. He just tried to knock me into the cactus. Yet here I was treating him so kindly. The next moment, however, his face turned pale at my words. Hanger, why did you steal from the estate? Mother-in-law and Huan Yang stared at me in disbelief. You vile woman, how dare you? My precious grandson would never steal from you. You gave that to him yourself. I dusted my hands off and stood up, casting her a sideways glance. Turning to the others, I said, you all saw this, didn't you? I didn't falsely accuse him. The guards I brought along all chimed in, of course not. It's clear that he stole it. You wretched woman, mother-in-law screamed. How dare you frame my grandson? You're truly malicious. I curse you to die a miserable death. She lost control completely, kicking and flailing like a mad woman, completely abandoning the dignified act she had put on for years. Terrified, Hanger threw the jade hairpin to the ground and hid behind Huan Yang. The jade hairpin shattered into several pieces as it hit the ground. I lowered my face, my expression darkening. Guards, take this child of unknown origin to the authorities. Not only did he steal, but he also tried to destroy evidence. Four guards stepped forward, grabbing the boy and dragging him toward the door. Mother-in-law and Huan Yang were terrified, chasing after them in a frenzy, trying to pull them back. By now, mother-in-law's earlier arrogance was completely gone. She was trembling and desperate. Even to other children, who clearly weren't from our household, were quickly driven out with sticks. At my command, the guards actually raised their sticks and swung them toward Huan Yang. She screamed in terror, grabbing the youngest child and running, but she couldn't escape. Taking several blows before collapsing, she was left dazed, barely conscious. Seeing me show no signs of stopping, mother-in-law broke down completely, screaming, "Stop, please stop!" I waved my hand slightly, and the guards halted their actions. Hanger had already been dragged near the front gate, his face covered in tears and snot as he crawled back toward me. "Madam, please, please let them go," he sobbed pitifully. "I'll give you the letter of separation." I smirked, tilting my head slightly. "Secure them for now," I instructed the guards. "I'll release them when the document is written." I wasn't worried about her going out and spreading rumors. In the eyes of the public, I was the helpless daughter-in-law bullied into submission. Even if she spoke endlessly, others would only think her actions were out of greed. For my dowry, with pen and paper ready, mother-in-law was finally cornered, but there was a problem: she didn't know how to write. I motioned for one of the literate guards to step forward and help write the separation document. After both mother-in-law and I pressed our fingerprints onto it, I left the Liu estate with tears in my eyes, hiding my face in the carriage. I occasionally sobbed, my shoulders shaking. Once I was safely inside, I couldn't help but smile, my lips curling upward. I instructed Schwanger to stay near the Liu estate for the time being, to monitor their activities closely, and report back to me with any news. At first, mother-in-law and Huan Yang managed to coexist peacefully, but the remaining shops had long since fallen into debt. The shopkeepers, cornered by creditors, had no choice but to confront them directly. The few shops and a small piece of land combined had accumulated nearly 20,000 taels in debt. The creditors relentlessly harassed mother-in-law and Huan Yang. Being women, they couldn't withstand the pressure for long. Eventually, they were forced to sell the estate. But just as they finalized the deal with a beer, the remaining servants drugged them and the Huan Yangs to children. By the next evening, when they gradually regained consciousness, the estate had been completely emptied. Mother-in-law, enraged and humiliated, suffered a stroke on the spot. Huan Yang, distraught and desperate, lost her mind when she realized her children were missing. She searched everywhere for them, even appealing to the authorities. But after a full day and night, there was no trace of them, with no one to care for her. Mother-in-law succumbed to illness within days, dying alone in the estate. Hu and Yang, driven completely insane, was discovered in the lake by the beer of the estate. Out of kindness, the beer sent me a letter informing me of the tragedy. When I rushed to the Lu estate, mother-in-law was still clinging to her last breath, barely alive. As for Hu and Yang, her lifeless body was found floating in the lake. Mother-in-law's eyes flickered as she saw me enter. Her eyes widened like copper bells. Her breathing grew ragged, her fingers trembling uncontrollably, but her body was completely immobile. I leaned in close to her ear and whispered a few words softly. Then I turned and left without looking back. Her mouth gaped open, desperately trying to suck in air but failing. Her bloodshot eyes seemed ready to bleed. Moments later, she passed away. I maintained a calm expression, arranging a simple funeral for them. I reported the loss of the children to the authorities and sold off the Lu estate at a low price. Then I took Schwanger and returned to the capital. Upon my return, cousin began visiting our household frequently. My parents, seeing his efforts, started to hint at a possible match between us. Cousin eventually opened his heart to me, confessing that during his stay at our house years ago, he had genuine feelings for me. Unfortunately, back then, my judgment had failed me, and I had chosen Lu Chen, tying my heart to him completely. Reflecting on it now, I felt fortunate that I couldn't sleep that night and stumbled upon Lu Chen's scheme. Perhaps fate truly has its own designs. 2 years later, on the eve of my wedding to cousin, the authorities sent word about the whereabouts of Lu Heng and Lu Chan. Lu Heng had been sold to a wealthy family as a servant boy. He was caught stealing from his masters to pawn their valuables, and was beaten to death when discovered. Lu Chen had been sold to a poor farming family as a child bride. The authorities offered to help me bring them back if I wished to adopt them. With a worried expression, I shook my head. Their reputations are already ruined. Bringing them back would only invite more trouble and suffering for them. Let them remain where they are. I wasn't magnanimous enough to take in the children of a family that had schemed against me. Nor did I intend to waste resources on ungrateful wolves. What's more, I will have my own children in the future.